Okay, so buckle up, everybody, because today we are diving into a topic that is both exhilarating and, let's face it, a little bit mind-boggling, right? We were talking about genetic engineering.
It's a big one, no doubt.
It really is. We're talking about a future, and maybe not even that far in the future, where diseases like cystic fibrosis are ancient history, like dinosaurs.
Yeah, like a relic of the past.
Exactly. But on the other hand, what if, and this is a big what if, the ultra-wealthy could essentially buy their way into a whole other league of, well, human evolution?
Yeah, it's like we're stepping into a whole new world, right? Where science fiction is becoming reality faster than we can keep up.
It really is. And our guide for this deep dive is an episode of the Alternative Worlds podcast, which, always has their finger on the pulse of these big mind-bending topics.
They really do, yeah. And this particular episode is called Genetic Engineering, Crafting the Perfect Human or Playing God. So right from the title, they're not shying away from the big questions.
Absolutely not. They really dive right in. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to pull out the most impactful ideas, break down the science in a way that hopefully doesn't melt our brains too much, and maybe, just maybe, walk away with a fresh perspective on where humanity might be headed.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, so first things first. What's the big scientific breakthrough we need to wrap our heads around here?
Okay, so the podcast does a really great job of explaining this revolutionary gene editing technology called CRISPR. Imagine having a tool that could target and, I don't know, like snip out a single misspelled letter in the entire Encyclopedia Britannica.
Okay, that's a pretty impressive level of accuracy.
It really is, and that's the kind of precision we're talking about here.
Wow. Okay, so how does that even work? What makes CRISPR so revolutionary?
Well, what CRISPR does is it gives us the ability to target and potentially correct the root cause of many genetic diseases. The faulty genes themselves. We're not talking about just managing symptoms anymore. We're talking about potential cures.
So are you saying that conditions like, I don't know, cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, Huntington's disease, all those things that have plagued families for generations, these could actually become a thing of the past?
Potentially, yes. And here's the really mind-blowing part. This isn't just some far-off fantasy. The podcast highlights that human trials using CRISPR are already underway. We are living in the era of gene editing, and it's showing some really remarkable promise.
Okay, so that's incredibly exciting, but to be honest, it's also a little intimidating, right? I mean, it's like we can't just ignore the potential downsides. So what are the risks that we need to be thinking about here? What does the podcast say?
Well, it's like any powerful tool, right? It has the potential for immense good, but also like the possibility of unintended consequences. One of the big ones they talk about with CRISPR is something called off-target effects.
Off-target effects. Okay, that doesn't sound good.
It's kind of like this, okay, imagine those molecular scissors we talked about. They're incredibly precise, right? But what if they accidentally make a cut in the wrong place in our DNA?
Oh, okay, yeah, I see where you're going with this.
It's a bit like accidentally deleting like a crucial sentence in the middle of some complex computer code. It can really throw the whole system out of whack.
Yeah. Now that makes sense.
So these off-target effects are still being studied, but they could lead to new mutations or like unforeseen problems down the line. It's something we have to be really careful about.
Right. So it sounds like while we're making incredible strides in one area, we need to be extremely cautious about the potential consequences in others. Like we could be creating a whole new set of problems without even realizing it.
Exactly, and those problems could become even bigger when we start talking about using CRISPR on embryos.
Okay, yeah, that's a whole other level.
Because, think about it, any changes that are made to the genes of an embryo, those wouldn't just affect that individual, right? Those changes would be passed down to all future generations.
That's like, wow, we're not just talking about individual health anymore. We're talking about potentially altering the course of human evolution, which is a pretty heavy thing to get your head around.
It is, and that's where the ethical dilemmas really start to emerge, especially when we consider what happened back in 2018.
You're talking about the Chinese scientists who used CRISPR to edit the genomes of twin girls before they were born.
Yeah, exactly. That case caused, like, a global uproar because it showed everyone that germline editing, making changes to genes that can be inherited, that wasn't just a theoretical possibility anymore, it was real.
It really shook things up.
It did, and it raised a whole new set of questions about, like, where the line should be drawn, because if we can do this, should we? And who gets to decide?
It's kind of wild to think about, right?
Yeah.
It's 2024, we can, like, order groceries with our voices, self-driving cars are becoming a thing. But we're also living in a world where someone could theoretically, like, gene edit a human embryo.
I know, right? It's like we've stepped straight into a science fiction novel, but it's our reality
It
now.
really is. So where do we even go from here? I mean, what are the ethical lines we're talking about?
Well, that's what the Alternative Worlds podcast really digs into. We're asking, like, okay, if we can edit embryos to prevent these horrible diseases, these life-altering conditions, is there even a line anymore? And if there is, where is it? And what's to stop us from editing for other traits? Things like intelligence or athleticism, maybe even eye color.
It's the whole designer baby idea, right? I mean, that always seems so far-fetched, like something out of a dystopian movie.
Right. But I mean, that Chinese scientist case, that really throws a wrench into things, doesn't it? Makes it all very real.
It does. It makes it all very real and scary, to be honest.
Yeah. And it highlights these really complex questions like, as a society, do we really want to live in a world where parents can basically, like, customize their children's traits before they're even born? What would that even look like?
And even beyond the ethics of it all, there's so many other potential consequences, right? I mean, like, the podcast talks about the potential for even greater social inequality if these, genetic enhancements become like a luxury good that only the wealthy can afford.
Exactly. Imagine a world where the rich can not only afford better education, better opportunities, all those things that already create such a divide, but now they can afford to enhance their children's intelligence, their athleticism, maybe even their lifespan. It's like a whole new level of inequality.
It's like we're headed to some kind of Margaret Atwood novel. This world where the gap between the haves and the have-nots isn't just about, like, wealth or opportunity, but about fundamental biology.
It's a scary thought. And it really makes you question what it even means to be human. The podcast uses this analogy and it's really stuck with me. They say if we can manipulate our genes this easily, does it like diminish our sense of self, our individuality, our accomplishments? It's like if an athlete wins a gold medal, but they got there through genetic enhancement, is it really still an achievement?
It makes you wonder, right? Like, are we at risk of losing something essential about what makes us human, about what makes us, if we start down this road of trying to engineer the perfect version of ourselves?
Yeah, it's a big question. And then there's the whole issue of unintended consequences, which is a whole other can of worms. The, what do they call it? Pandora's box?
Exactly, because the human genome, it's so complex, right?
Hmm.
We're still in the very early stages of understanding how it all works. The podcast uses this analogy of a spider web. You tug on one strand thinking you're just making a small adjustment, and suddenly the whole thing vibrates. The whole system is affected. So we might think we're making an improvement by editing a particular gene, but it could have these, like, ripple effects throughout the entire system.
And we have no idea until it was too late.
Exactly. I mean, it could lead to new diseases, unforeseen mutations, maybe even mess with the very things that make us resilient as a species. Wow. Okay. It's pretty humbling when you think about it like that.
Yeah.
And honestly, more than a little terrifying. I mean, it really feels like we're walking this tightrope, don't you think? Like, on the one hand, you have all this incredible potential of genetic engineering, right? The potential to cure diseases, alleviate suffering, all of that. But then on the other hand, we're talking about messing with the very fabric of what makes us human,
Yeah.
The stakes are really, really high.
Absolutely. And that's exactly what makes this whole conversation so crucial. It's not about putting the brakes on scientific progress, not at all, but it's about making sure that all that progress, all that potential, it's got to align with our values, with what we want as a society. Otherwise, we're kind of just like driving blind.
Right, right. And so that brings us back to the Alternative Worlds podcast.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, with all the stuff they unpack in this episode, what are some of their final thoughts? How do they think we should be navigating this whole, like, uncharted territory?
Well, they definitely don't shy away from the tough questions, that's for sure. They end on kind of a, cautiously optimistic note, I guess you could say. Like, they acknowledge the huge potential for good, but they also leave us with a lot to think about. One of the big things they keep coming back to is this question of, like, how do we even define progress in the age of genetic engineering? Like, even if we have the ability to engineer ourselves to be smarter, stronger, live longer, does that automatically equal a better world?
It's like that old saying, right? Just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Exactly. And it makes you think about, like, what really matters? I mean, is it about just maximizing certain traits, like some kind of checklist for perfect humans? Or is there something to be said for diversity, for the, like, complexity, and maybe even the imperfections of what it means to be human? Those are the questions we got to be grappling with.
It's a lot to unpack, that's for sure. But I gotta say, I think this deep dive It's been really helpful. It's highlighted just how important it is to be asking these tough questions now before we race headfirst into a future we might not be ready for.
Totally agree. And that's what I think is so great about that Alternative Worlds episode. They don't pretend to have all the answers, right?
Yeah.
But they give you the information, the different perspectives, and they really make you think for yourself.
And that's really what it's all about, right? So, to everyone listening, if this conversation has piqued your curiosity, even just a little bit, I highly recommend checking out the full Alternative Worlds episode. It's a wild ride, for sure, but it might just change the way you look at this whole crazy world we're living in. And maybe, just maybe, it'll inspire you to start asking some of those tough questions yourself. Because the future, it's not set in stone. We all have a role to play in shaping it.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The future is what we make it, right?
That's right. All right, everybody, that's it for this deep dive. Until next time.
Take care, everyone.